It's lesson 8, part 3. We finished our local authentication. And what we want to do is use another passport package, another passport strategy, so that we can log in with GitHub. So we're going to have to do a couple things. If you have NodeMon running, first of all, you're going to want to stop your application because we're going to use an NPM package to install. And the package that we need, I'll show it to you. So what we want is Passport GitHub 2. There is an original Passport GitHub package. It's very old, hasn't been updated for years. So there's a newer version. So we're going to install Passport-GitHub 2. We'll do that together. We're going to need to log into our GitHub account and create an application in the GitHub portal. That's going to generate a client ID and client secret. We'll then have to do some configuration of Passport in our app.js, Passport GitHub. And then we'll add some routes, a get and post, that will allow us to try to sign in with GitHub. We'll also have to modify our model a little bit and modify our database. So step 1 is for us to install the package. So we're going to do npm I passport-github 2. And I will put this in the chat as well. So let's install Passport GitHub 2. Okay. We can actually restart our app with NodeMon now. If we want. Our next step is we want to modify the model, our user model. So under models and user, let's open that up. So right now, we've got a username and password, but when we sign in with GitHub, we're not actually going to get their password. Their username we'll get from GitHub, but we won't get the password. So I'm going to add a few extra parameters here. I'm going to add an Oauth ID. So this will be a profile ID that we get back from GitHub. This will be a string. Because we're going to make this generic in case we're only going to do GitHub, but let's say we wanted to do Facebook, Facebook, Google, some other kind of sign in. Any provider will give us an ID back. We'll also add an OAuth provider as a string. So when someone signs in with a third-party service like GitHub, we can record in the users collection which service they used. Did they use GitHub, Facebook, Google, Twitter, something else? And we'll also maybe add a created, just kind of a timestamp as a date. So I'm going to add these 3 fields to the user schema. So our user schema in our users model, I'll put it in the chat, but I'll leave it up for you as well. So I'll highlight the things I've added. So I've added these in blue, the comma after password, and then the 3 additional properties. So when we create local users, these 3 new properties, they'll be blank. We really are only going to use them when somebody signs in with an external service. Any questions so far? Does that make sense? So our next step is going to be to go to our globals file, and we're going to need to set up, much like we did in ASP.NET with our configuration, we're going to need to set up a GitHub configuration section so we can add the client ID, client secret, and a callback URL. So after someone authenticates from GitHub, we need to tell GitHub what URL on our site, where do we send them back? So I'm going to open up my globals file. If you need me to come back to the user model, let me know. And I can do that. So in our globals file, after the database, the DB node, so I'm going to put a comma at the end of this line. And I'm going to put in a new section for GitHub. But rather than GitHub having one variable, it's going to be its own JSON object. And in here, we'll have the 3 API parameters that we're used to working with from last semester. We're going to have a client ID, which for the moment we'll just set as an empty string because we're going to have to go to GitHub and generate this. We're going to have a client secret. And we're going to have a callback URL. So GitHub knows what URL to send the user to after they authenticate. This one we'll just hard code for now as localhost 3000. We'll do GitHub callback. So you can add this section to your globals file, what's highlighted in blue, including the comma here after our database connection. So I'll save those changes. And then we're going to need to go to GitHub, much like we did with our Google sign-in. We went to the Google Developer Console last semester, created a new application, which generated the ID and secret. We're going to need to do the same thing in GitHub. I figured we use GitHub because we've already sort of seen how it works with Google. So I thought we would use GitHub for this instead. It'd be something a little new. Any questions so far? Or are you okay with what we've are set up so far? Okay, thanks, Maggie. Yep. So I'm going to give you the link in GitHub. I'll put it in the chat as to where we go to create a new application. Unlike Google, which has a separate kind of portal for this, it's just part of our regular GitHub. So I've put the link in the chat. So we go to github.com/settings/applications/new. It's a bit weird because there isn't actually a button to take you to this link, which is a bit annoying. So we want to register a new OAuth application. So I'll call this, I don't know, COMP2106 project tracker. We have to put in the homepage URL. So that'll just be localhost 3000. Our description is optional. And our callback URL, it's the callback URL we put into the globals file. So, and I put it in the chat already, we'll use this URL. So unlike in ASP.NET, where it was predefined for us, we can use any callback URL we want. So I'll use this, I'll put it in the chat as well. I'll use this. So fill out your OAuth. Again, the description you can leave out. And when you're done, click on register, and then that's going to give us a client ID. And we manually then have to click a button to get the client secret. So we're going to do that next. So I'll click register application here. It gives me a client ID, and then it will give me a button to generate a secret. So I'm actually going to copy this client ID, and I'm going to go to the globals file and I'll paste it in there. Right, we just initialized it as an empty string. I'm going to copy it in. And then I'm going to go back to GitHub, click the Generate Secret button, and then I'll paste it in here. Justin, you need to add HTTP. You need the HTTP prefix in front of it. That's why. Thank you, Hung. So you can click Generate a new client secret. It asks you to confirm your password. Now it says, make sure you copy it now. You won't be able to see it again. So if you don't copy it now, you can never see them. You'll have to generate a new one. So I will just copy that and I will paste it in as my client secret value. Make sure I take out the spaces at the... So there are my credentials. Later on, if I want to deploy this to Heroku, I would want to change the callback URL. But for today, I'll just make sure it's local. Right, so you could change the URL here. So I'll click update so it saves my secret. So now we've got our configuration set up. So we've installed Passport GitHub. Justin, through here, I don't think so. I don't think there's the ability to do that. It looks like it's only giving us one spot. So we might test it locally and then update. Let's look under redirect URLs. Have to look a little more into how we would do that on Justin. For the moment, we'll just do it locally. So now we need to open up our app.js and configure our GitHub authentication strategy. So most of our work is in app.js. We'll then need to add, on our login screen, we'll add a separate button to log in with GitHub, and then we'll need a simple get and post handler. No problem, Iraq. It happens. So we'll go to app.js. So I'm going to scroll up here. So here's our local passport. I'm now going to add Passport GitHub. So maybe I'll add it up here. We've already got a section that says Passport Libraries for Auth. So this one, I'm going to call GitHub Strategy. And it'll require passport.github2. But in here, we're going to use the GitHub strategy. So we're not just requiring the whole library, we're requiring a certain class inside of this library. So the syntax is a little bit different. So I'll put that on line 15 underneath the other passport references that we've made. So that's step one, is add this reference specifically to the strategy class inside of the package. We're going to need to make a couple of little changes to app.js, and then we'll need to add one method. So this creates the local strategy. We're also going to now configure our Passport GitHub strategy. So we'll call passport.use, and we're going to use a new new GitHub strategy. So when we configure our GitHub strategy, we now need to read those three values that we put into the global file: client ID, client secret, and callback URL. So our client ID is our config.github client ID. Our client secret so we're reading these things from our config file. We don't really want to hard code these kind of values into app.js. So this now reads the three values from our GitHub application. So there's sort of three parts to this method. This is the first part. Connect to this GitHub application that we've created. So there's step one. After my closing curly brace, I'm going to put in a comma. So now we need to write the code. When somebody tries to sign in through GitHub, there's two things that could happen once GitHub authenticates them. Right? The first possibility is they've never signed up to our site before, so we want to add them to the user collection. The second possibility is they've already signed in and they already have an account on our site with GitHub. So we just want them to log in. So we need to handle both of these scenarios. So after successful GitHub login, register or login user. So we're going to make an asynchronous call. We'll use the keyword async. When we call a GitHub login, there's a few parameters that come back. We get an access token, which we don't need, a refresh token, which keeps their session alive. What we're primarily interested in is we also get their GitHub profile. So that's what we're interested in, is the GitHub profile, and then a done method, which is kind of like next. So we will see if this user already exists. So we'll call find one. And we're going to look for their GitHub ID in the profile ID that comes back from GitHub. Does GitHub user already exist in our DB? Right, so we're going to check when they come back from GitHub. If they do exist, we'll just return this done parameter and pass the user back. So yep, this person's logged into our site before, we're done. Here's the user profile, we can stop. If we've never seen this GitHub user before, we want to add them to our users database, to the users collection in MongoDB. So in this case, we'll create a new user. And we're going to grab some of the information from their GitHub profile and then save them. So our username will be the GitHub profile, and it's got a username parameter. We'll set the Oauth ID as their profile.id. So this will be a unique identifier that comes from GitHub. We'll set the provider. We'll just hard code this as GitHub. And we'll timestamp them as being created now. So if they don't already exist, we're going to create a new user object and then save them. So we're going to save them to MongoDB. And now we'll call done. And we're going to return our new user. I guess this can end here. So we're configuring our parameters for GitHub. And then we're telling our application what will happen after a user authenticates through to GitHub. We're going to look in our database and see if they already exist. If they do, we're just going to return that user object. If they don't exist, we're going to create and save a new user and then return that new user. So I'll put all this up on paste bin. I'm also going to open up MongoDB Compass so that we can look in the database as we try this out. Sure. The documentation on, that's a great question, Maria. The documentation on this isn't very good. Let's go and look at it for a moment. It doesn't tell us a lot, so bear with me. Let's go to the Passport site for a second. Let's look at what's here. So if I go to strategies, okay, so the strategy verifies a callback and calls done, which provides a user as well as any options. So when we call done, it's kind of like it works the same way as next in effect worked here, right? We're called next. So it basically means continue whatever you were doing. But done allows us to now also send information about this user after they've been created. So when we carry on to our next page, we now have access to this user object, whether it's a new user or a user that already exists in the database. So it's kind of similar to the next method in Express. This is built into Passport. Does that help at all? Or not really? Okay. We're almost done, but not quite. Let's open up Compass and connect to our database. So as we try this out, we do have a couple of little more changes we need to make before we can test it. But we also want to be able to look in the database and see if we try to sign up with GitHub, what happens. So I'm going to connect. And go to my COMP2106. So right now I've got a users collection, right, with 2 documents. I have user at GC and user 2. So when we're done setting up GitHub, we're almost there. We're going to try to log in with GitHub, and then we can see what a GitHub user looks like. It's not going to have a salt and hash because the password is stored on GitHub, right? We're not generating our own password. So I've configured the GitHub strategy. We're going to need to rewrite these lines. These only work with Passport local. If we look at the documentation from Passport GitHub, it tells us, oh, it doesn't tell us in here. It does, I think, on NPM. Let's go here instead. We'll look at our Passport GitHub 2 package here for a minute. So it tells us how to configure, which we've done. Right, the documentation is poor. We'll try it like this, but I think we're going to have to modify these lines. In my testing we did. We'll leave these lines for now. So let's just add a login with GitHub button. And then we'll need basically these 2 lines, which I'll modify a little. We'll need a get at GitHub and a get at the callback. So let's open up our login view. And let's add, maybe I'll just add a space here. And then another, I don't want this to be a button. It'll just be a link with a class. It'll look like a button. And it'll say log in with GitHub. And my href will just be /GitHub. I'll put this in the chat. So we'll now have a second login button. So I've added what's in blue beside our regular login button in views login.hbs. So our login screen will now look like this. Whoops. Where are we? Okay, cannot access config. What's the problem? Oh, we're declaring our configuration all the way down here on line 83, but I've tried to use it up here, 40 lines above. So I'm going to move our global vars config declaration. So this section here where we connect to our configuration file, we need to move this up. So for me, it's line 83, wherever this const config is declared. I'm going to cut that out. And it's got to go above our GitHub configuration. So I'll maybe just put it, I don't know, even right here. As long as it's before the first place we use config. So just move it higher up in the file. And I save. Okay, interesting. Requires a client ID. Notice how this is spelled. Capital I, capital D. It's weird, it's not camel case. It says if you're using an OAuth strategy where I've got client ID, this actually has to be a capital letter here. And it's going to be the same, I think, for our callback URL. So the code I gave you, I'll put it in the chat. For some reason, these are all caps. Not really following the convention, but that's what's in Passport. Okay. Hung, you may be missing something else. That seemed to fix it for me. So I moved my config declaration above, and I changed ID to all caps and URL to all caps. So check that you've made all three changes. We may still have to deal with these. Okay, so my login button shows up, but it won't work yet because it's calling GitHub. There's no get handler for this. So this result is expected. So there's a couple methods here in the documentation. I'm going to modify them a little bit because their path is not quite the path we're using. So we've got two methods that need to go in our index controller. I'm going to scroll to the bottom. Two get methods. Get GitHub. Try GitHub Auth. So when we have a login request at /GitHub, we're going to call passport.authenticate with GitHub. And GitHub Auth also requires what it's called a scope. So what information are we asking for from GitHub, which is their email? So this will try to log them in, and then we need the callback routing. So at GitHub/callback, again, we call passport.authenticate, GitHub. If it fails, we'll take them to log in again. And if the GitHub login is successful, we'll redirect them to load the projects. So here's our callback. So this one calls GitHub. This is what happens when they come back from GitHub. Now we may still get an error with the session. So we may have to make one more change to this. But we will try it as it is and see. I will try it. So now I'm going to try to log in with GitHub, right? It calls our project tracker. It'll redirect us here. I'm going to authorize. And now it shows my GitHub username and I'm logged in. Cool. So what does this look like in the database? If I refresh my users collection, right, it stores my GitHub username. Yeah, I thought it was 2. And we battled with Google last semester. I'm not a big Google fan. Just got rid of my Android phone. So I thought we'd use something else. So here's the profile ID from GitHub. And it shows that, so at least we know, hey, this user uses GitHub sign-in. So if we want to look in the database and find all our users who are using GitHub, we're storing it, right? Because when we create a new user in app.js, right, when we create a new user, we're hard coding that the provider is GitHub. So now if I sign out and sign back in, right, it's not going to create another record. I'm already in here. So when I sign back in, right, it tries to find me. It says, is there a user with this particular GitHub ID? Which there is. Uses my GitHub ID here. So in this case, as Maria's asked, it just calls done. Basically just calls next and passes in the existing user profile. When we first signed in, we didn't have a user, so our code carried on to create a new one first. So one of the options you can try in your assignment is you can try implementing an additional sign-in provider. Google, Facebook, Twitter, anything you like. You don't have to, though it's not required. I'm not giving you marks for doing GitHub. We kind of did GitHub together. So if you want to do a sign-in provider, I want you to find another one. If you want to do something else for your optional feature, you can. Okay, so we've basically taken care of all the authentication pieces we wanted to. We've controlled access. We have both So our nav bar reflects. We've controlled access through the controller. We've created a read-only view of our data. And we've allowed somebody to sign in with their GitHub account as well. And yes, if we were going to deploy to Heroku, we'd have to change the callback URL in our GitHub application as well as in our globals file. Okay, I'm going to push everything. So we've now got GitHub Auth. So I've pushed it all. So it's available. So I know we did a fair bit today. I appreciate everyone's patience, questions, participation. So for next week, you do have your project plan. Okay, so you'll want to fill out that document and submit it by Wednesday so that next week I can put you in with pairs and partner you up. And you can get some feedback on your project plan for next week. Okay, and that'll be marked. I'll also put the groups together for the tutorials. And I'll go over the full requirements for the tutorial next week in class. Okay, so for next week, all you've got to do is your project plan. All the code is up on GitHub. I will get today's lesson videos uploaded. Yeah, absolutely. You can start. So you have everything you need to do the project, for sure. There's nothing. Next week, we're actually going to start into Angular, and Angular is not required for the project. So everything that you need to do the whole assignment, we've covered. So feel free to get started, absolutely. It's a good idea. The more time you give yourself. Yep, Angular's like Vue. It's another front-end framework. Uses TypeScript. So we're going to learn TypeScript. We're going to spend the next 3 classes getting to know Angular. Good question, Justin. Yeah, so it's an option. Vue is kind of a newer competitor to Angular. Angular's been around longer. Angular was created by Google. It uses TypeScript, which was created by Microsoft. I know you guys are doing Vue with Albert. So some of the knowledge and learning you're getting from Albert will help you with Angular.